First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at this seminar. And today I'm going to present some work that we have done sometime few years ago under a different funding. It was NSF funding, and now we are using actually some of the tools developed in that specific project to further enhance our work in membranes in the context of NAWI. Here I'm going to talk about rough or wiggly membrane topology and morphology for fouling control. I'm going to go fast in the intro so that we can possibly spend more time on the technical part. I do not have to defend to this audience that water availability, equitable availability and access to potable water is key to development. However, we know that there is too little and too soon. We see on the left the blue planet, but then if you essentially kind of collect all this water in 3 different bubbles, can you see my pointer? Yes, no, maybe.
Yes, yes.
Thanks. So then, you know, what you would see here is that this large sphere is all the water in the ocean, ice caps, lakes, river, groundwater, and so on and so forth. Even the water in you, your dog, and your tomato plant. In the middle sphere, it's the liquid fresh water, so groundwater, lakes, and swamp water and rivers. And then in this super tiny bubble is water in lakes and rivers. So it's immediately obvious that a lot of water is in the oceans, and this is just a quantitative observation of a quantitative assessment of that very trivial observation, and therefore one clear way to be able to access and to provide more potable water is through desalination. So now this is a pie diagram of different techniques that are used in desalination, and we see that reverse osmosis membrane has a good share in terms of water potabilization. So what is reverse osmosis? So generally speaking, is a process by which if you put a semi-permeable membrane and you technically push really hard, then the pores of this membrane are so small. They are so small that essentially the solute dissolved in the water will be stuck on one side of the membrane while the water molecule will go through. And this is just a picture that shows actually how small these pores in these membranes are. In the back, you see a red blood cell that is in the characteristic size of 6 micron, and then the reverse osmosis membrane pore, and this is not in scale, it's essentially 3 orders of magnitude smaller. In the middle, you see just the size of a bacteria. So quickly, what is osmosis? Well, if again we have 2 solutions, one concentrated solution, you have solvent, let's say water, and then salt, and then on the other side we have a less concentrated solution. And if you put a semi-permeable membrane where the membrane is essentially permeable to water but not to the salt, then the system will try to reach equilibrium, so to reach equal concentration on both sides. But since the membrane is semi-permeable just to the water molecule, then what you're going to observe is the flux of solvent from the left to the right. Now in reverse osmosis, the process is essentially the opposite. You practically apply a force, you push really hard to really reverse the process and to take the system completely out of equilibrium. So you want essentially to create a highly concentrated solution on one side and then fresh water on the other side. And you can imagine that this will require a good amount of energy to be applied to the system to keep it out of equilibrium. And so one common problem with reverse osmosis membrane, but also other types of separation processes, is fouling. This is just a quick schematics of how fouling works. Again, it's very intuitive. We are now looking at the membrane from the top. At the bottom here we have wastewater, so it's the feed side, the dirty water, which we want to purify. if you push this feed water parallel to the membrane, then you would have permeate flux orthogonal to the membrane surface. And, if the membrane is clean, then of course you would have a clean water flux that then you would collect and, put somewhere. But then the problem is that since, again, the feed site is loaded with salt or other substances, then in the process of generating a clean water flux, then you would build some foulant on the membrane, which will lead to a local impairment of flux, right? So you see here that the arrow is a little bit smaller, and so wherever the membrane is clean, then you can still reach the maximum flux, but where the membrane is foul, then of course you can achieve complete full clogging, right? And so the problems associated with foulant are twofold, and they are kind of the face to face of a coin. On one hand, it creates immediately permeate flux impairment, so it decreases the permeate flux that you can potentially have from an otherwise clean membrane, but at the same time increase in energy input. So if you want to again push through the same amount of water, you can possibly still can, but you have to operate system at much higher pressure, which means that you are increasing energy input, and the increasing energies in the use of the operation of these systems, of course, it's something that you would like to avoid, both for financial reasons, but also for really environmental reasons, right? And so the question of controlling fouling is an old question, and there is no single answer. And the reason that there is no single answer is because the system is multi-scale, as it is outlined here, and you can literally try to affect the outcome at different scales. We can operate at the chemical level, where essentially where potentially you could modify the interaction force between the membrane and the foulant, the foulant molecule at the nanoscale, right? Or you could try to do modifications on the surface of the membrane. So, for example, patterning it in some way or form. And we will refer to this type of treatment as topological modification, topological alteration of a membrane. So these type of alterations are at the micron millimeter scale. But then you can also do it at a much larger scale, for example, by looking at the separator, right? So you can do modification of the membrane shape or separator morphology at the system scale, which is at the centimeter scale. And so when people, engineers or scientists try to alter the system and engineering system performance, the first place they look for inspiration is generally nature. And so if we think about topological modification of a membrane to again alter its macroscopic properties, then the immediate thing that comes to mind is the lotus leaf, where you can see that by changing the pattern of the surface of this material, you can alter its wettability, and this has a clear implication for the membranes, because ultimately you would really like things to stick less, right? And so this, in other contexts, has been done. There has been, in the past 20 years, a lot of studies in how to modify, to pattern surfaces to achieve different, surface properties that are desirable. These are applications to drag reduction in, laminar and turbulent flows. But some similar studies have actually been performed in the context of membranes, where certain membranes were actually fabricated with some micro patterns on top, and it was observed that in fact under certain conditions you could decrease fouling, and this is just one of the studies that are available. There are many more. Another possibility is, again, to alter the spacer morphology. So instead, let's say, of having membrane channels that are classical rectangular shape, one question could be, okay, what if we do morphological modifications of the spacer such that the morphology of the channel changes on a much larger scale, like the meandering of a river. And so also this has been investigated and some benefits have been observed. And here I provide the reference. Now, the question that we started asking actually emerged from the fact that there didn't seem to be an overall agreement of when and what technique would be helpful in fouling. So certain studies reported very clear advantages by doing given modifications, but other studies did not seem to necessarily agree on that conclusion. And so what we started wondering was, okay, how do we, does this depend on dynamic conditions? So yes, we can do morphological or topological modifications, but does the performance of these type of modifications actually depend on the dynamic conditions in which we operate the system? If that's the case, how can we formulate a problem in a way that is holistic and that can allow us to assess in the same framework whether it's best to do, let's say, rough or wiggly. And so the general question was, okay, how do we essentially create a framework that allows us to evaluate the structural changes, either morphological or topological, at different scales and evaluate them at the macroscopic scale in a fair way. And so there are different approaches. Of course, the classical approach is to do trial and error. You come up with a design, you fabricate it, you run experiments, you record your results, and then you go through an iteration schemes, and then based on your knowledge, experience, intuition, you design something new and then try to see whether the performance is better or not. And so the advantage of this approach is that it's true, which is something that should definitely not be underestimated. And it's fun, but the drawback is that it is expensive because you need to have a person there doing these experiments. So it's an investment of human capital, but at the same time, it's also slow converging because the iterations are always just an epsilon, possibly different from the previous one. And technically, you have a much higher chance of converging to a local optimum rather than to a global optimum, depending on where you start, right? So the other approach is to use computational tools, right? So, and the clear advantage is that it allows you to span larger parameter space automatically. You don't have to have a person look at the screen while the simulations run. The drawback is that it can become computationally expensive and then it requires experimental validation. In our case, we really did not have a choice, and so because we are not experimentalists, and so we kind of moved towards the second option, and we, immediately it was obvious to us that there were a number of challenges that had to be addressed for us to think about the problem in a way that was meaningful. So first of all, we needed to account for full coupling of flow, solute bulk transport, and foulant surface concentration. We had to account for all dynamical feedbacks between these three different physical processes. And so the coupling couldn't be just one way, but it had to be a two-way coupling between these processes. We wanted to predict system level quantities, pressure drop and permeate flux, because these are the quantities that then we can use for validation against experiments. But we also wanted to try to predict the spatiotemporal evolution of the fouling pattern and try to do that with few or no fitting parameters with a kind of underlying scientific hypothesis in our group that if you got the physics right, then you shouldn't be spending a lot of time calibrating the model once you got your parameters right. And these predictions in different conditions should be essentially parameter free. And so there are, a number of models that have been developed, and I'm just going to broadly talk about two categories. So there are approaches that include the modeling of flow, solute, and fouling. The advantage is that, they do couple flow and transport, right? So you do have full coupling, but oftentimes the fouling is just modeled in terms of concentration polarization, not as a surface concentration, so not as a different quantity than concentration polarization. So generally, the idea in these models is that if we can get a very accurate distribution of the concentration field in the bulk, and we can appropriately represent concentration polarization, then we would be able to know roughly where fouling is because they are strongly correlated, right? But we do not technically distinguish between them. Other approaches have looked actually at modeling fouling separately as a surface concentration, but the approach was simplified in terms of removing the coupling between these physical systems, which can be a challenge, especially in the presence of high nonlinear systems like the one we are looking at. And so what we proposed was a model where really our primary objective was to retain the temporal dependence, so just not looking at steady state configuration, but really looking at the full evolution of the flow field and the fouling field. We wanted to see where the fouling started initiating, because that can be used, this knowledge can be used for design. And then our primary interest was to separately model surface concentration for the foulant and bulk concentration for concentration polarization, and account for the full coupling between the hydrodynamics and the foulant onset. In particular, we wanted to model what the picture that I showed you before, where you have a full feedback between the deposition of the fouling at a certain location and the concurrent decrease of the flux because of essentially clogging or, because of this layering effect. And so what we did was we just used the Navier-Stokes equation to model the flow field, then a standard advection-diffusion equation to model the bulk concentration. And then essentially the way we propose to model this coupling between hydrodynamics, bulk transport, and surface concentration was through the boundary condition on the membrane. So I would like to emphasize that in our model, the membrane represents the boundary, but it also represents the location where the coupling between all these physics occur. In particular, this is the boundary condition that we propose. So this is the flux, the permeate flux. This is the classical osmotic term that you would have and drives the flow through the membrane. But then we have a kind of a penalty term that is related to the local surface concentration of the foulant. So if you increase the surface concentration in the foulant locally, you are essentially decreasing the volume, the flux, but changing the flux changes the boundary conditions for the flow field. And so that's how the feedback loop is implemented. And then, I mean, these are classical equations that are generally, boundary conditions that are generally used to, model, again, the flux through the membrane in terms of the bulk concentration, and then to model the kinetics of the foulant accumulation on the membrane. And so in this model, essentially, as I briefly mentioned, we account for time evolution. We account for full coupling through that additional term in the boundary condition for the permeate flux that allows us to explicitly distinguish concentration polarization from surface concentration of foulant. So it fully couples the flow field, concentration, foulant deposition, and it links the flux reduction with foulant accumulation on the membrane. So the quantities of interest that we looked at were, first of all, the definition of what a non-fouled membrane surface is. And so the way we define it numerically is the location on the membrane where the concentration is, the surface concentration of the foulant is thresholded according to a given criterion. Okay, so if surface concentration is lower than some kind of value, then we consider that non-fouled. And then based on this definition, we can define the permeate flux as the total permeate flux as just a surface integral on the membrane surface that is not fouled. And then, of course, we have a pressure drop in the channel, which is the driving force. The first thing that we did was to essentially validate the model. We did it by using a unsteady measure from previously published work and fouling patterns. So here you see the experimental measurements are the dots, and then the solid line is the prediction. And here you see in red, this whatever color this is, purple, no. Anyway, so magenta maybe. Okay. I'm not colorblind, but so this with the numerical simulation. So we were able to capture both the temporal dynamics of a very pretty long temporal scale, and the spatial dynamics at steady state. So we started looking, we wanted also to validate the fouling pattern. That was one of the critical parts we were interested in. So we went back to the study that was previously published by another group, and what we did, they provided pictures of the fouling pattern, the fouling. We extracted the geometry of each spacer. And then essentially what we did, we ran the simulations, and then we did a comparison in this pressure drop flux type of diagram, where the experiments are the black symbols, and these are the measuring errors. And then our numerical simulation is really the corresponding symbol, but in red. So we were pretty happy with these predictions as well. So then in terms of global measurements, we did well. The question was, could we predict actually the fouling pattern? So what we did was to first proceed with image processing of the images, of the experimental images that were given to us for this different fouling pattern. The R1 is essentially the rectangular classical shape of a channel. Then what we did was to convert this image into a grayscale to extract, essentially, to correlate color intensity to surface concentration. And then by thresholding it, we obtained this fouling pattern for different morphologies. And then we compared the data and the model. So the data are the red plots, while the model predictions are the blue plots, and you see that we can actually capture these asymmetric tails in these fouling patterns at the peaks and troughs of these wiggly channels. So far so good. Still, though, we absolutely had no idea how to assess the performance of concurrently of membrane topological and morphological modifications within the same framework. So how do we know when one is better than the other? They are both equally good. How do we make an assessment that it's good for design and engineering these membranes in real systems? And so what we understood it was needed was a couple of things. So we need shared quantities to optimize, and then shared design and decision variables. And so we took a step back, and we said, okay, let's go back and let's look at the straight channel case, and let's start to define dimensionless numbers that can help us understand what are common parameters, regardless of what type of modifications you can make. And so first of all, we needed something related to the performance of the membranes. And so we know that permeate flux is one of the critical elements to assess performance, but also pressure drop. And so we defined two dimensionless numbers, the Sherwood and the Bejam number, which are corresponding with the non-dimensional counterpart of the total permeate flux and the total pressure drop. So technically, we would like to maximize, for each configuration, we would like to maximize the Sherwood number and minimize the Bejam number. And then, of course, there are expected dimensionless numbers like the Reynolds number, Peclet number, the Darcy number, and the Damkohler's number that represent the reactivity, these absorption reactions that control the dynamics of the foulant accumulation. So then if you non-dimensionalize your system, you get what you get. And then we started looking actually, and it was still too complex, so we couldn't understand nearly anything. And so we said, okay, let's try to see what happens in the long time scaling limit. And what we wanted to do is to identify the relationship between pressure drop and permeate flux when the system reached equilibrium in the long time limit. And so we wanted to essentially calculate some function like this, right? And we actually were able to derive this analytically in this limit. And the derivations are in the paper, but what really matters are like two main points. At steady state, what we saw is that the Sherwood number can be written as a function of Bejam number only, plus all these other dimensionless numbers that are intrinsic, represent some kind of that are fixed, right? That they don't depend on operation conditions. It's the geometry or the permeability of the matrix or of the membranes and stuff like this. And then, but the other important point was essentially that there was somebody missing from this. We would have expected an explicit dependence on Reynolds number, but we didn't find it. And so that suggested to us that maybe Bejam and Sherwood number had the same scaling in terms of Reynolds number, and that's why it disappeared from this derivation. So once you have an analytical solution now, you can look at a lot of different things. And so we started actually looking at the asymptotic behavior of the Sherwood number in terms of the Bejam number for different values of the Bejam number. So the two classical limits. What happens if Bejam goes to 0? What happens if Bejam goes to infinity? And so what we found is that these two limits actually are different. And then, so we know essentially how the Sherwood number scales. And the reason why this scaling is important is because now we can use this scaling to actually try to understand how this overall filtration performance index scales, right? So what we did was to define this filtration performance index as a ratio between Sherwood and Bejam. It includes, again, these two factors that we care about, membrane permeate flux and pressure drop. And by knowing the individual scaling of this Sherwood number as a function of Bejam number, we could know the scaling of this performance index, which is ultimately what we would like to maximize. And so these are just some, this is just how the scaling of this performance index looks like for different values of the Bejam number. And this is just the plot, so there is nothing there. So now that we have that, we start having like a little bit of a context in which to analyze these different morphologies, right? So first of all, what we wanted to do was to validate that analytical scaling that we had found, right? Because if the analytical scaling is correct, then we could literally use the performance index and this representation in terms of Bejam and Sherwood number as a common ground to analyze membranes with different modifications at different scales. And so what we did was to essentially develop synthetic examples. So we looked at morphological modifications, so wiggliness, membranes with wiggly channels, 10 different configurations where the M0 is the straight channel. So the M type of modification is the morphological modification, the wiggly one. Then we consider 3 topological modifications, so where we have pattern to the surface of the membrane with pillars of different sizes and heights and stuff like that. We considered 3 modifications where the pillars are aligned and 3 modifications where the pillars are staggered. And then we considered 3 hybrid patterns where we combine both morphological and topological modifications. And so we started running simulations. This is just shows how the surface concentration of the foulant looks like. So you can start, guessing of where the foulant is going to start accumulating these different configurations. And so some observations that I would like to make before we proceed is that the previous analysis provides like a first step, although still incomplete, framework to study membrane performance. And why is that? Why it is? So it is useful because we have somehow a way to, we have a shared objective, which is this membrane performance index, but still we have an issue. In presence of topological or morphological alterations of the membranes, additional length scales are introduced in the problem. And in our dimensionless numbers so far defined, we have absolutely whatsoever accounted for this aspect, which is the most important thing, right? And since the input velocity and the length scales associated with the membrane alteration are the primary decision variables, because the input velocity is the operation condition, and the length scales are essentially the design characteristic of our membrane, we wanted an explicit dependence of the filtration performance index C on the Reynolds number, and that this Reynolds number had somehow to include these additional length scales that could account for morphological and topological modifications. And so that's what we did. We kind of defined out of a hat practically these dimensionless scales. So this ratio, I'm going to go back just to the figure that shows the geometry. So the first ratio is the ratio between the shortest distance between the sides of the membrane with the essentially largest with this inlet distance. And then the second is just the depth of the membrane minus H star, it's the height of these features, of these topological features. So this is some kind of dimensionless numbers that allows us to describe the topological pattern, right? So we see that if there is no topological alteration, H star is equal to 0 and this is equal to 1. And so this value can change between 0 and 1. And so once we defined these length scales associated with these alterations at different scales, then we essentially redefined the dimensionless Reynolds number as a rescaled classical Reynolds number where we included these length scales, okay? And then we essentially checked, whether this plotting data against this Reynolds number could tell us a little bit more. So here I'm plotting again the Sherwood number, which is the dimensionless permeate flux, and the Bejam number, which is the dimensionless pressure drop as a function. So in the inset as a function of the classical Reynolds number, and this is for all the geometries. What you see is that if I plot it against the classical Reynolds number without accounting for any of these scales, all the data are scattered, so not useful. But if we use now this rescaled Reynolds number, at least in some regions, it's for some values of the Reynolds number, I get a collapse. So I can actually infer the scaling between this Sherwood number and this dimensionless, this Reynolds star. And the same happens for the Bejam number. We also see that our hypothesis that the reason why in the analytical solution there was no explicit dependence of Sherwood number and Bejam number because their scaling was the same with the Reynolds number seems to be true. So they both scales with the Reynolds square. So once we have that, we actually validate our analytical scaling with whatever the numerics tell us. And what we see here is that this is the analytical scaling that we found, and these are the numerical simulations. So what we see is that the analytical scaling that we derived is actually accurate over a certain value of the Bejam number. Now that we have confirmed this scaling, we can now do what we really care about, which is actually try to understand this dimensionless performance index in terms of this Reynolds number for all different geometries, right? And topological and morphological modification. So I would like to emphasize that where we are here, we did what I in the beginning said was the problem, right? So we needed a shared optimization target, which is now this index performance index, and then we needed a shared parameter, right? And this one now is a shared optimization parameter, design parameter, because now this includes both topological and morphological modifications. So it allows us to evaluate different things in the same framework. So with this, essentially what we did, these are all the simulations together. What we did, we extracted the best performer for each category at each Reynolds number. And then essentially we came up with this plot. So again, this is a plot of the dimensionless performance index as a function of this rescaled Reynolds number. So the blue, dark blue, represents the do nothing option. So this is the straight channel without any type of modification. The middle blue is morphological changes, so where we do the wiggly channel. And then the light blue is the topological modification, so where we add roughness, engineered roughness to the membrane. And so what we see is that we have actually three different regions. The first region to the left for low Reynolds number shows that the best performer between morphological and topological modifications of the membrane is actually wiggliness. So if you do wiggly channel, globally you gain, both in terms of pressure, of decreased pressure drop and increased permeate flux. Instead, the topological modification actually is worse than the do nothing option. And the explanation is actually quite simple. Imagine that you have very low Reynolds number, so very slow flow, right? So everything is very viscous. Then you have a lot of shear stress, right? So essentially all the pressure drop comes from the shear stress. But then you essentially, by adding bumps to the surface, you are increasing the surface, and so you are dramatically increasing the shear stress, but you are not gaining anything in terms of reduced pressure, reduced permeate flux, because since the flow is slow, it also accumulates a lot of foulant. So you'd better do nothing rather than adding patterns if you do not have the right combination of Reynolds number and topological features. There is the last region, so then there is a transition region, and then there is the last region where if you, on the other hand, are operating at higher Reynolds number, or at least at the combination of Reynolds number and modifications that are compatible, then you would then the topological modifications perform better in terms of better than morphological changes. And again, this is also intuitive. If you imagine having a wiggly channel where flow is really fast, you may expect that because of the wiggliness, you have a very strong resistance to flow, and so you have to use a lot of energy to push the flow through. But the local decrease in fouling is not able to counterbalance the amount of energy that you are inputting to overcome essentially this wiggliness, right? And so at higher Reynolds number, then topological modifications are expected to work better. So with this, I would like to conclude. So what we did was to develop a modeling framework for fouling in reverse osmosis membranes, which is fully coupled. So we want to account for these three different physics, and is also unsteady. The solver has been validated, and then we kind of introduced this concept of Well, we use this concept of filtration performance in terms of this dimensionless Sherwood and Bejam number as a possible way to analyze systems that can be technically very different. And we also introduced a modified Reynolds number that allow us essentially, this is the design parameter, right? It includes both the morphological and topological design, so the static part of the design and the dynamic part of the design. So it includes the topology and morphology, but it also includes the velocity field, right? The input velocity. And then we did numerical validation and showed that this Reynolds star seems to represent a good, appropriate scaling variables for all 114 numerical simulations that we ran. We demonstrated that these curves, these performance Reynolds star curves, can actually be used to both identifying best performance designs within each modification type, so morphological modification and topological modification, as well as combined design, like hybrid designs. And then these are really the last two comments that I made, that at lower Reynolds star, morphological changes improve the overall membrane efficiency over the benchmark and topologically altered membranes, so the bumpy ones. But for higher Reynolds number, the situation is reversed. The topologically altered design are superior to all morphological designs. So the surface roughness seems to be able to significantly reduce fouling while only moderately increasing the pressure drop. So with this, currently we are using SAMs and incorporate new capabilities. We have in the context of NAWI. So now we are really looking at incorporating turbulent effects through RANS simulations. And also we have also included density variability and non-constant parameters to account for essentially effects of concentration on density. We have also generalized this model to this SAM to model MD systems, and so this is exciting work, and hopefully I will have further updates. So with this, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Elenia. I think so there's one question so far from Leon. Is there a major distinction between biological fouling and inorganic scaling in your analysis?
So unfortunately, the only way at the moment we can account for different types of fouling is through the coefficients, right? This coefficient. Can you still see
Yes, we can still see your slides.
So, and I'm rolling through them, right? Or do you see them
yes.
Okay, yeah. So the only way at the moment that we can account for this is just by changing the coefficients in the modeling equations. We have not implemented alternative models to model different types of fouling. We do not have, honestly, the knowledge to do that, but if anybody, so here, so the only way we can change the type of foulant is by changing essentially these coefficients, K1, K2, and A0. We have not done an extensive study on seeing what type of foulant is best represented by this model. So if it's only a matter of choosing the right parameters, or if you really need like a different equation. But I would love to have this conversation if you have knowledge on this.
Thank you. And I noticed on your slides where you showed the images from the actual fouling versus what you had in the simulation, that there was significant amounts of sort of random bits of fouling that happened outside of the places where your simulation expected.
Yeah.
Is that just such a small amount that there's no point in trying to represent any of that, or is that worth trying to add some sort of a randomness feature to this?
No, this is an excellent point. So I would argue that, of course, the more so that the objective should be to try to get things as realistic as possible, because it's very hard to make an assessment of how important that layer, those little bits are, a priori. It's convenient, right? If I say, yeah, they don't matter at all, right? So my preference would be that we would be able to capture those. Now, I like the idea of adding roughness. I always balance, when we do modeling, I always try to balance model complexity with results, right? In the sense that the moment you start adding complexity, you need to add parameters, right? And then you need to add calibration effort and I think it would be interesting to look and see, whether this threshold between model simplicity and predictivity still balances out. Yeah, it could be an interesting thing to look at. In terms of validate, the only way I can tell you whether it matters or not is in terms of validation, right? So if adding this would increase the match by a given percent, and that percentage is relevant in design, then I think it should definitely be done. But we wouldn't know a priori. So probably we should do it and then see if it was worth the effort.
So we have another question. Can the model be extended to capture things like hotspots?
Well, so can I have a clarification about what, I have a certain idea about hotspot, but in a different context. What do you mean by hotspot? It's like just localized, concentration, localized area where concentration may be really high, things like that?
Localized high flux.
Localized high flux. Well, the argument is that if the physics is correct, then you don't need the generalization. This should be seen from the model. This is my argument. So I believe that the model should already be able to do that. But unless we do localized measurements, right, from experiments, this is purely speculative, right? But the model is the model, right? So it predicts what's inside. And to model hotspots, you do not need additional physics, right? This is not additional physics, it's just the same physics. Where, for whatever reason, be it geometry, be it, again, coupling and there is, strong variations of flux. So I think the model should already be able to do that. And I would love to know whether there are data that we can use to try to validate even that aspect.
Okay, thanks. So we have another comment/question. It's counterintuitive that roughness can reduce scaling. Clearly, this is not the case in thermal processes.
So the way I think about roughness, right? So it all depends, right? And that's why I cannot comment on thermal processes. So I'm sorry, we can have a separate discussion there. I would like to know more what you mean by that. But so in terms of this specific context, right? So you can think about, so roughness, it all depends. It depends on the flow field, right? If the flow field is fast enough, right, you can imagine that you can create recirculation zones beside the posts, right? And so you can essentially have just localized fouling, in very small locations behind the posts or behind these patterns. And if the flow is pretty fast, then essentially you would create a very localized, a patch of foulant right behind, But if you play around with the density of these pillars or whatever structure, then essentially you know where the fouling will be and how much the wake, how big the wake of this fouling will be. So if you can control the recirculation zone beside these pillars, then to me it's not counterintuitive. At low flow, at low speeds, yes. At low speeds, you know, he wouldn't be a winner. You would do worse, right? Because you are further decelerating the flow, and what we saw is that essentially fouling, accumulation of fouling, is anti-correlated with shear stress, right? So the idea about the way I think about fouling and flow is that if I can locally increase the shear stress on the surface of the membrane, I will decrease fouling. So I just have to create a fluid field that has a high shear stress, because then you would have a sweeping effect. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Thank you. And I guess I have a follow-on one on that, because I guess I'm curious, would it make a difference if the membrane was different behind the pattern, right? If you propose that the fouling, the deposition all happens right behind the post, then, you know, let's say I was able to manufacture a membrane that assumed that, and therefore didn't make it porous or able to transmit, you know, right behind the post. Would that change the equation?
Well, it would just change. So essentially, the only thing you would change is your domain, right? Where you have to account. So in these particular simulations, our posts were not permeable. Okay, they were just impermeable posts. And so because of that, the boundary condition on the post is like no slip, so you do not have anything. So it would not change anything. It would just change literally the setup of your simulation. It would not change your equations. In collaboration with David Ladner and Scott Hassan at Clemson, we are actually generating membranes with some patterns where the patterns are permeable. And so in that case, of course, you know, things change, right? But for this specific simulation, the posts were impermeable, but it doesn't have to be that. You can have parameters that are spatially varying, right? And this is ultimately what would be very nice, like to essentially have a membrane where, assume that you decide that the pattern works for that specific configuration. Maybe at the inlet, you can have a certain pattern, right? In the middle, you can have a different pattern, and at the end, you can have a different pattern. So you can do heterogeneity in pattern topologies. And, you know, depending on how you want to alter the flow field locally at different, you know, locations along the membrane. So everything is possible, but the formulations would be the same.
So I guess one last question on validation. Now that you've come up with these results, have you had a chance to then try and predict, you know, a best pattern and then test that membrane?
No, we have not done yet. We were supposed to be doing it. We ran out of time. No, we are actually, so we did not do, we did not get to the point of doing like complete optimization, right? You know, spanning really the entire parameter space diligently. What we did, sorry, was to essentially come up with a pattern that had a specific feature. We essentially wanted to create a reversible pattern, reversible to flow, such that you do not have to stop the operation to clean the membrane. So you would use just continuous flow, and you reverse the flow to clean it alternatively along different paths, so that you don't have to stop operation. And so it was not optimized based on, you know, this performance index, but it was optimized based on, you know, the idea of not stopping operations. And they are actually now at Clemson, they are, they have manufactured it. And now we are in the process of seeing whether our simulation can in fact predict. It's, we call it tire thread. It's like essentially chevrons like this. So they are symmetric, whether you flow this way or that way. And you can alternatively clean up because of local shear stress, certain channels, depending on which direction you flow. So, but yeah, we haven't done that. We are in the process of.
Okay, so one last quick one. Have you looked at different treatment options beyond the backward flow?
No.
That can impact the fouling?
No.
Okay. So we're reaching, we're reaching the end of our hour, and I want to thank everybody for joining and for the excellent questions. And Dr. Battiato, I think now I've got it, for this excellent presentation and for this nice research. And I want to remind everybody the next of the seminars on modeling and simulation topics is going to be May 3rd, and that'll be Aaron Wilson from the Idaho National Laboratory. And that will be a speciation-based solution model emerging from solvent-driven aqueous separations. That will be at 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern as well, just like this one. So thank you, everybody. And if you have further questions, please feel free to reach out directly to Dr. Battiato and ask those questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.